Chapter 7. Baron Karl von Rothschild. The Naples Firm. Italy once consisted, like Germany, of a number of separately governed states, which, however, were not as in Germany associated in a general bund or confederation for the protection and support of their common interests. The language was the only link that joined the various Italian states together. In all else they were separated by long-standing hatreds and jealousies, which were the greatest obstacles to the progress and prosperity of the nation. It was these continued feuds and the enmity of Austria that so long barred the way to the formation or development of a united Italy worthy to take a leading part in the affairs of Europe. To establish a branch of their business in the leading state of Naples, when the political condition of the country was so disturbed and uncertain, may at first sight appear to have been a somewhat rash and ill-advised move on the part of the Rothschilds, but a little consideration will show that this step was the result of mature deliberation and shrewd calculation. The very feuds and jealousies so prejudicial to the welfare of the land proved the source of much of the profitable business which the firm afterwards secured. The states were always in need of funds to carry on their wars, and, being well nigh bankrupt from past campaigns, were forced to seek from other quarters the assistance they required. Besides, the system on which the administration of the finances of most of the states was conducted was so thoroughly rotten that borrowing was perhaps the only way left open to them of meeting the current expenses. The extent of the business transacted by the Naples branch was small compared with that transacted by the houses in Paris and Frankfurt, still it was in proportion, perhaps, more lucrative. The number of its clients was limited, but these few clients were regular and frequent applicants for assistance. In addition to this, trade and commerce, favored by the situation of the country so surrounded by the sea, through the extensive bill business they created, proved no unimportant source of profit to the banker, and over this business Rothschild, by virtue of his peculiar relations with the bourse and the state, held undisputed sway. During the present century a wonderful transformation has been brought about in the political condition of Italy. Formerly, as we have already said, the numerous states and principalities were divided from each other by continual hostilities and old, established family feuds. To look upon themselves as forming one great people never entered their thoughts, for from their birth all the great princes had been taught that it should be their first duty and absorbing ambition to avenge the insults their family had suffered through the instrumentality of their traditional enemies. To shake hands with their hated rivals, and, for the good of the nation, to live in brotherly amity together, would in their opinion have been dishonorable and infamous. With time, however, these bitter feelings have passed away, for the misfortunes which the various states all suffered in common gradually drew them together, and year by year Italians grew more willing to recognize that they all belonged to one great fatherland, and insensibly yielded to the more elevating inspiration that one invisible bond of union linked them all together. At length an ardent longing to see the nation rise from its ashes, and like a giant refreshed open out for itself a new path of honor and fame, took possession of many energetic minds, who strove, and ultimately with success, to create a united Italy. The story of Mazzini and Garibaldi, and of the association of Young Italy hardly belongs to these pages, and is, after all, too well known to require repetition. The social conditions ruling in Italy offer the student many an agreeable picture, which he in vain seeks elsewhere. The line which marks the distinction between the nobility and the less favored orders is not so sharply drawn as in other countries. This is indeed clearly shown by the history of many of the noble Italian houses who rose to their rank from having won wealth and fame as energetic and enterprising merchants. And it is undeniable that the commoners were always highly esteemed, and enjoyed an aristocratic importance which no doubt fostered the opinion, so prevalent in Italy, that it was no disgrace, but rather an honor, for a noble to increase his own wealth and the prosperity of his dependents by commercial enterprises. The nobles and the commoners in Italy were not separated from each other by the haughty pride and the overbearing manners which have in other lands kept the two orders so far apart. This, perhaps, is the reason why the nobility of Italy have furnished so many talented writers and poets, for they were not kept by false pride from the pursuit of knowledge, but displayed a praiseworthy zeal to place themselves on a level with their rivals of whatever rank, in science or art. The finances of the Papal State form one of the darkest and most unattractive pages in the history of the country. We shall not carry our review further back than to the period of the First French Revolution. In the year 1790 a small detachment of French troops marched against Rome. Willing or unwilling, the Romans were forced to accept the revolution. The Republic was proclaimed in the Forum, and the French Constitution introduced. To the French commander-in-chief at that time the power of a dictator was given. Bills for large amounts were issued upon the richest of the Romans, on whose behalf the French general was kind enough to accept them, and afterwards to compel their payment on penalty of death. Under the extravagant rule of Pius VI, the finances of Rome were in the most deplorable confusion, and the paper money fell to an unusually low value. The French government entered into a contract with Torlonia, the banker, by which the latter undertook to purchase some millions of such money, which he could issue afterwards at his own risk. The paper was sometimes quoted at 10%, often only at 5%, but the public had taken it up at almost double this price in silver, so that Torlonia was not only able to carry out his engagement, but to make an immense profit by the transaction. The Roman system of finances was based on the law of the 19th March 1801, and the mode of carrying it out on the principles borrowed from France was so utterly bad that it can be safely affirmed that the financial administration could not well have been worse. The cost of collecting the taxes was enormous, but the peculation and fraud prevailing were indescribable. The treasuries should have been full to overflowing, nevertheless they were empty. The state expected to obtain money at a low interest, but could with difficulty obtain it even on the most usurious terms. No budget was drawn up, nor were the accounts examined. No one concerned himself with the financial balance sheet. Under Sextus V, the income of the papal chamber was infinitely less than that contributed by the faithful Catholics all over the world to the Roman spiritual tribunal. The taxes, with the exception of the direct taxes, were all increased, as the falling off in the revenue became evident. The price of salt was raised, and the lottery established. Loans were called into requisition, the interest on them being gradually reduced from 6 to 3%. And paper money, which had been so extravagantly issued by the unscrupulous government of Pius VI, was again put into circulation. When Pius VII ascended the papal chair, the people had been drained to their last drop of blood, and, as the paper money had become almost worthless and the credit of the state was gone, it was difficult to see any way out of the impending ruin and bankruptcy. When matters were in this most distressing condition, the financial decree of Cardinal Lanti of the 19th March 1801 was issued. By this the land tax was fixed according to the register of 1777, and all the other old taxes abolished. A house tax was imposed, as was one on all loanable capital. Foreigners and travelers were also affected by the new regulations, and a succession duty was made law. In addition there were salt and malt taxes, whilst the same law decreed the reduction of the interest on all the loans to 3%, and the realization of all common lands. After the abolition of the Roman states in 1809, the French system of taxation was introduced, with some necessary modifications, on this side of the Apennines, the Italian system remaining in force in the provinces on the further side. For instance, the meal tax was retained in place of the droitsarum, the land tax was augmented, and registration adopted. When the papal government regained possession of their land in 1814, the earlier system of taxation was restored. The motu proprio of the 6th July, 1816 lowered the land tax about 400,000 scudi, and, after various gradual modifications, the old system was practically restored. The gross receipts were estimated at 9 million scudi, though in all probability they did not exceed 7 millions. Previous to the First French Revolution, almost 2.5 million Roman florins in church dues found their way from the faithful Catholics to the papal coffers in Rome. To this large sum Spain contributed 640,000 florins, Germany and the Netherlands 488,800, France 357,000, Portugal 260,000, Poland 180,700, the two Sicilies 136,170, the other Italian states 170,000, and Switzerland 87,000. While about the same amount was received from Northern Europe. These subscriptions in aid of the head of the church afterwards showed a great falling off, consequently the financial situation of the state changed gradually for the worse. Since the incorporation of the Papal States by Victor Emmanuel in the Kingdom of Italy, they have ceased to have a separate financial system of their own, as the taxes imposed on the rest of the country are enforced in what was formerly the Pope's material dominions. The expenditure of the Duchy of Parma was estimated, in the year 1854, at 2.5 million lire, and its debt at 14 millions. The latter had been increased in 1827 by a new loan of 12 million lire, which the Duchess arranged through the mediation of the Rothschilds and the firm of Mirabaud and Co. in Milan. In addition to the compulsory loan issued in 1849 of 2,700,000 lire, Parma was saddled in 1854 with another 5% loan, voluntary in this case, of 2,470,000 lire, in obligations of 501,000 lire each. This last loan was secured upon the state property and the private possessions of the ruling family. The expenditure of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany with Lucca was estimated at 5 million florins, the receipts at about the same sum, and the banknote and paper circulation at 2 million florins. Their joint debt dated first of all from a loan of 30 million Tuscan lire, which was issued in bonds of 1,000 lire, bearing 5% interest. An additional loan of 12 million lire, in bonds of the same amount, and bearing the same interest as the above, was made in the course of the year 1851, through the intervention of the firm of M.A. Bastogi and Son in Leghorn. As security for this loan, the iron mines and foundries belonging to the state were hypothecated. The small 3% loan of 3 millions, concluded towards the end of 1852 in bonds of 2,000 lire, can hardly be reckoned as forming part of the state debt, as it partook more of the nature of a compulsory loan, issued only to meet immediate and pressing wants. We should have passed it over in silence had not the firm of Rothschild taken part in its issue, as they did in both the loans for the Duchy of Lucca in 1836 and 1843, which, after the union of that duchy to Tuscany, were added to the public debt of the latter state. The Kingdom of Sardinia, with over 5 million inhabitants, had an old-standing debt on which 5,836,393 francs rent were annually paid, and this debt was increased in 1848 and 1849 by the addition of 18,771,680 francs rent, so that at the commencement of 1850 the total debt amounted to 382 million francs, costing the state annually 19,108,073 in the way of interest at 5%. In 1850 a loan of 140 millions and a premium loan of 18 millions were found necessary, and were followed in 1851 by one for 3,600,000 francs, all being required by the share Italy took in the campaign of the Western powers against Russia. The state expenditure in 1847 amounted to 90 million francs. In 1856 it had risen to 139,157,385 francs. Between 1848 and 1856 no less than 13 new loans were brought out, amounting in the aggregate to 553 millions, and swallowing up yearly 30 million francs in interest. What comparatively little profit the state derived from the loans is seen by the loan of the 12th July, 1850, for 80 millions, which, however, only brought in 64.5 millions. So great was the drain upon the resources of the kingdom, caused by the cost of the army in the Crimean War, that a further loan of 30 millions was found unavoidable and necessary. The Sardinians might well adopt for their motto the well-known saying of the Prussian finance minister, Hansmann: "Freedom costs money, for the debt by which the state was burdened was out of all proportion to its population." Sardinia, however, was self-reliant and patriotic, and always showed itself ready and willing to respond to the calls made upon it by its rulers. In the case of the loans which were brought out, the Sardinians displayed extraordinary unanimity in supporting the government, for they themselves not infrequently covered these loans several times over, thus rendering any appeal to the assistance of foreign bankers and nations unnecessary. For instance, in 1849 and 1850, besides providing the annual interest on the large debt already existing, the Sardinians subscribed an additional loan of 18 millions, and in 1851, when a further loan of 18 millions was asked for, more than double the amount required was subscribed in a very short time by the native bankers and capitalists alone. Of the many loans brought out by the Rothschild house, only that for 80 millions in 1850, and a second for rather more than 67 millions in 1853, were for the Kingdom of Sardinia, whose usual agents for this sort of business were the firms of Barbru and Tron, Migon in Turin, C. J. Hambro and Sons in London, and the Geberder Bethmann in Frankfurt. The Kingdom of Naples, or the Two Sicilies, suffered for a number of years from the evil influence of a bad financial system, combined with the calamities and trials through which it passed. Measures of every sort, from the introduction of new taxes to the sale of the state domains, from the raising of the taxes to compulsory loans, were all tried to effect some alleviation of the state's difficulties after Joachim Murat was deposed and Ferdinand I ascended the throne. In order to pay the interest on the state debt, loans were repeatedly found necessary. In January 1821, the yearly rent payable on the debt amounted to 3,882,000 Neapolitan ducats. In 1822 the government contracted a loan of 16 million ducats with the Rothschilds. This was followed by 3 successive loans, which Baron Karl von Rothschild, the head of the Naples house, refused positively to undertake, unless his friend the Chevalier Medici, who had been banished to Florence, was recalled and reinstated as Minister of Finance. On this condition, and this only, would Baron Karl assist the government, as that would be the sole guarantee he could, he said, possibly accept of their fidelity and good intentions. There being no other person at that time capable of assisting the government, it is almost superfluous to add that his terms were accepted, though not with a very good grace. Medici was once more restored to the favor of the king, and the 3 loans were issued. The first of these so-called English loans, concluded with the Naples house of the Rothschilds, was that of 1821, amounting to 16 million ducats capital, bearing 800,000 ducats interest. The second loan, bearing interest at 5%, was for 20 million ducats, costing yearly 1 million rent. The third was that known on several of the European markets under the name of Rothschilds bonds, and was for £2,500 sterling. By a decree of the 26th May, 1821, the king separated the finances of Sicily from those of the Kingdom of Naples, and concluded a loan for the benefit of the former for 1,500,000 ounces, 4,500,000 ducats, in bonds of 400 ounces to bearer. The interest on this loan was paid through the Rothschilds in Paris. In 1834 the papal government proposed to convert the papal 5% debt into a 3% debt, for which the opportunity seemed highly favorable, seeing that the 5% were quoted at 102 to 104. To carry out this scheme, Cardinal Tosti, the papal treasurer, started off to Paris in order to arrange for a concerted plan of action with several banking firms in that city. At that time the Parisian financial world stood in peculiar relations with the Rothschilds. The notorious omnipotence the latter exercised in all government loan business, not only of France but of other countries, was an intolerable burden to the notabilities of finance, the other bankers, who resolved at length to make an effort to cast it off. 6 of the leading houses, namely J. Hagerman, Ander and Cottier, B. A. Fuld and Oppenheim, J. A. Blank, Colin and Co., Gobber, Odier and Co., and Wells and Co., accordingly combined to form a syndicate to challenge the Rothschilds, enter into spirited competition with them, and if possible shatter the fetters by which the financial world in Paris was bound. In the first loan, a Sardinian one arranged on the plan of the Paris State Lottery, the syndicate obtained some success, as they managed to wrest this business out of the hands of the Rothschilds. J. Hagerman personally contributed greatly to the success achieved, as, having formerly been established in Genoa, where his firm was acknowledged to be the first and largest, he was on terms of intimacy with the Sardinian minister Coccia, and through him with the firm of Coccia in Paris. The latter, having neither means nor influence enough to carry out the business entrusted to him by his brother, placed it in Hagerman's hands. The Rothschilds, who were never so forgiving as to allow a rival quietly to outbid them, felt, as might be expected, annoyed and vexed by this unexpected blow, and were not long before they let the weight of their wrath fall upon the presumptuous confederates by ruining what might under other circumstances have been a profitable transaction, and rendering it a costly and expensive one. The second time the syndicate tried to compete with the despots of the money market, they found that they had challenged a rival whose forces were so immeasurably superior that victory a second time was out of the question. The fall manipulated by the Rothschilds in the value of French securities reacted upon and affected the prices of the Sardinian stocks, which continued to sink steadily until they reached a heavy discount. This was enough to render the 6 allies somewhat timid and nervous. Still Ander and Cottier saw so clear a profit to be derived from the conversion of the 5% into 3%, that they at length, after some consultation with their colleagues, declared themselves prepared to dispatch an agent to the papal exchequer to secure the business and ratify the contract. When the agent was admitted to an interview with the secretary of Monsignor Tosti, one of the first questions put to him was the weighty one: what guarantee will the papal government have for the due fulfillment of the contract about to be made? To this the agent replied the names of the allied Paris bankers, adding that he was for the moment forbidden to give their names, but that the secret would be divulged after the conclusion of the contract, and in the event of the names not being satisfactory, that the contract could be considered null and void. After the agent had had several conversations with the cardinal, the matter seemed to be nearing its conclusion. Inviolable secrecy was promised on both sides, but the papal officials are not remarkable for their discretion or for their fidelity in business matters. Scarcely had the agent quitted Rome than the matter was publicly rumoured about. The Rothschilds, too, through the many influential friends they have among the officials of every government, were always sure to hear of such negotiations, so in this case the Naples house got wind of the proposed financial operation, and at once sent one of the younger partners to Rome. No sooner did he learn the exact position of affairs than he produced the contract entered into by the papal government, when the 5% loan was undertaken by Rothschild in conjunction with the firm of Torlonia. This contract contained a clause, till then forgotten, by which the papal chair engaged to enter into no definite treaty for any subsequent loan without giving the Rothschilds previous notice, and also to accord them the preference when their terms were not higher than those offered by other firms. The earlier loan had been concluded before Tosti had assumed the management of the finance department, consequently he was quite in the dark as to this important condition in the contract. He and the agent accordingly determined to draw up the conditions of the proposed conversion and leave the Rothschilds and the allied bankers to settle the rest. It was of course to be foreseen that, if the business proposed was lucrative, the Rothschilds would never let it slip from them, and whether it was likely to prove a profitable undertaking they were as well qualified to judge as their adversaries. On the other hand, the only chance left the latter was to undertake the business on much less favorable terms, should the Rothschilds see fit to place themselves in their way. Still, the coalition of the Paris bankers was not to be ignored by the Rothschilds, who might have experienced much annoyance and trouble from the opposition they would have called forth if they had made full use of their privileges and influence to secure the business for themselves. Finally, matters were settled in an amicable fashion and a common understanding arranged between all parties with reference to the matter in dispute. Rothschild certainly did not lose by his forbearance, whilst the rivals learned that their strength was still far too weak to damage the sway of the millionaire financier. It is unnecessary almost to add that Baron Karl von Rothschild, for the many valuable services rendered to the Italian states and princes, both by loans or by advances of money, was honored with titles and orders of every description. He died on the 11th March, 1855. The business was for some years continued by his son, Baron Adolphe de Rothschild, who, however, soon tired of the anxiety and responsibility attaching to the management of so large a concern. Being of a nervous disposition, he could not hear without fear and alarm the rumors of the internal troubles which threatened Italy, and like a wise man, blessed with a handsome fortune, he retired from public affairs to enjoy the comforts and repose of private life.